Hi, everybody. This is Pastor Andrew Miller from Revival Tabernacle in Jacksonville, Florida. I'm glad you could be with us once again as we get ready to get into the Word of God. If it's your first time with us, I'd like to encourage you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you can join us as part of this journey of what God is doing through this ministry. By just hitting that subscribe button, you won't miss any of the sermons we are sharing via this platform. And I encourage everyone watching this video, if you haven't had a chance yet to pray for a moment and open your heart and mind spiritually speaking for what God would like to say to you through this sermon, then please push pause for a moment and just talk to God. Get your heart, your spirit, your mind right, and then continue on with this lesson so that you are able to receive what God would like to say to you through this Bible lesson. I also want to point out the fact that throughout this sermon, today, you're going to hear some questions I'm going to ask you and some action points I'm going to point out. These are things I would like to have you interact with, and I put these questions or action points in the lesson so that the Bible lesson can be more interactive and more impacting on your life. And by answering these questions out loud, and participating in these action points out loud, it helps your brain and your mind, your heart to interact with what the lesson is saying so that you get more out of what's being preached and taught through this lesson. So please actively participate through this lesson here today. If you'll please turn in your Bible to the book of 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 5 through 8. I'm going to read out of the King James Version. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 5 through 8, the Bible says, "And beside this, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge temperance, and to temperance patience, and to patience godliness, and to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness charity. For if these things be in you and abound, they make you that ye shall neither be barren nor unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ." Today, for a little while, I would like to speak to you from this idea or theme or subject. To increase my impact, I must increase my discipline. Once again, today's theme or idea or subject for the title of this sermon, I'm going to title it, "To Increase My Impact, I Must Increase My Discipline." And as we read the text today in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 5 through 8, did you notice how each element built on each other? In this spiritual cascade of elements, one particular theme built on the previous one. And this process continued in this passage until the end of the thought pattern. And at the end of the discussion, the Apostle Peter taught that the progressive addition of each element he mentioned would cause someone to be fruitful and successful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. It's this progressive addition of elements and the way in which they work together to produce an ultimate successful product that I'm interested in discussing with you today, but in a different vein of thought. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, verse 13, that we are the salt of the earth. He also said in Matthew chapter 5, verse 14, that we are the light of the world and a city set upon a hill. His teaching implies the kind of impact and influence that we're supposed to have on the people around us. We have the capacity to make a huge impact on this world and be a huge positive influence in the lives of the people with whom we interact. Unfortunately, though, for many of us, we're not as influential in the lives of people with whom we interact because we're so undisciplined in so many ways. And we have the potential to be way more influential than we currently are. But regardless of what we tell people, our example will preach the loudest sermon. Our example will influence the most people. And our example has the potential to eventually have the biggest impact on people's lives. I want you to understand today, therefore, that people don't tend to listen to us as much as they tend to observe what we do and how we live. I know we oftentimes would like to believe the delusion that people really pay close attention to what we're saying and that they hear everything we're saying. But that's not always the case. For the most part, you know how we are. Think about how you are, and I can think about how I am because it's human nature. We tend to be more observant of what people do rather than pay attention to always what they say. Therefore, our example has the greatest capacity to make a difference in this world during the short time that you and I have to live here. If we want to maximize our impact and influence the most amounts of people possible by our example, then we must definitely increase our personal discipline. I feel the Lord shared this with me recently via prayer and meditation, and I want to discuss with the following progressive sequence with you that I think could really help you achieve that maximum impact in people's lives, if that's what you desire to be. And I think for many of you who are watching this sermon video today, it is your desire, it is your will to maximize your impact in the lives of people. And so I want to help you understand what it takes to get to that point if we're willing to put in our part. If we want to increase our impact, we must increase our influence. If we want to increase our influence, we must increase our example. If we want to increase our example, we must increase our discipline. Now, before I dive further into this lesson and begin to break down each one of the points I want to point out today, let me go ahead and say right up front, I'm still working on me. I am still a work in progress. I am not a finished product myself. There are still areas of my life that I could improve on and need to improve on and am currently working to improve on. And all of us, if we're honest, have areas of our lives where the condition seems to be the same. We need that improvement and we have work to do. So I don't want to come across to anyone as someone who already has all of this completely under wraps, completely under control in every area of my life. In some areas of my life, I'm doing great. I've got this down pat. In some areas, in other areas, I'm still working on change and progress. So I think we all have the potential to do better, to be greater, to have a bigger influence and impact on our lives, on our world, and on the people we interact with. So starting with point number one, increase my impact. That's the point that I want to start off with today, is increasing my impact, because that's sort of the foundational idea or principle. That's the goal, at least, I suppose, for those of you who are watching this video today, is to increase your impact in the lives of people. Now, I get it. There might be some of you watching this who have no interest whatsoever in impacting anybody's life. You don't want to change anything. Perhaps you're fine just as you are. And look, that's fine. If that's your goal in life, is to impact no one, keep being who you are and how you are now, and you will have succeeded at impacting nobody. But for those of you who say, I was put on this planet, I was put in this world for so much more than just the mundane, the mediocre, and the things I'm going through, and I really want to make a difference in people's lives, listen up to what I want to say to you today. If you're wondering, just in case, when I discuss the impact on people and increasing my impact, what exactly do I mean? Well, for the sake of context, let me give you a definition. According to the dictionary, the word impact means to have a strong effect on someone or something. So when I discuss having an impact, I'm speaking about having a strong effect on someone or something, and in this case, on the lives of people. We want to have a strong effect on them. And I think that everyone has an impact on people in one way or another. The difference among us is a matter of degree of impact and the amount of people impacted, because some people have a very small impact on others in this life, while others have a huge impact. And as we're going to discuss through this lesson, I think the degree of your discipline will ultimately determine the kind of impact you ultimately have on others. That's going to be the final topic I get into later in this lesson. But I want to show you, as I pointed out in our main text we read in Peter today, this progression. I think there's a progression to get there, and we need to understand the foundation and then the progressional steps to get there. And then you'll be able to look back and see how the ultimate product brings us to the ultimate goal. And I hope that makes an impact in your understanding of this subject here today. And so the more, for example, when I say that as we go through the lesson, I think the degree of your discipline will ultimately determine the kind of impact that you have on others. What I mean by that is the more undisciplined you are, for example, the less impact you'll have. And the more disciplined you are, the greater impact you'll have. Jesus Christ lived a highly disciplined life, which is a huge reason why I think he had such a tremendous impact on people. Also, we could look at the Apostle Paul, who was a highly disciplined man if you study his life, which is perhaps one major reason he was also so highly influential in his lifetime. I'm sure if you studied some of the greatest entrepreneurs, scientists, ministers, artists, and the host of highly successful people out there, you would realize that there is one huge common denominator, and that is that these people are generally highly disciplined people. Typically, the least influential among us tend to be the poor, the uneducated, the average human being, because generally people in these categories, the poor, the uneducated, the average human, people in these categories generally tend to be very undisciplined, and their minuscule impact on the world, I think, is evidence of this. I think even if you look at the parable of the talents in Matthew chapter 25, it illustrates this idea, in my opinion, because several men were given talents, they were given gifts, but it was the one who was very undisciplined with what he was given who made the least impact, and it was the ones who had the most discipline who had the biggest impact. So that brings me to my first question that I'd like to ask you, and I hope that you will answer this question out loud so that you can interact with this sermon here at this point. And the question is, can you think of a few highly successful people who you know are that way because they are also highly disciplined? Once again, can you think of a few highly successful people who you know are that way because they're also highly disciplined? So take a moment, meditate on that question, answer that question out loud, and then I'm going to continue on with this lesson here. Famous former American baseball player Jackie Robinson once interestingly said, "A life is not important except in the impact that it has on other lives." And I think that's a very interesting quote, because the only way we can see how important our life was in general to people on this planet was and is based on the impact that we have on others. So when we leave this world, if we had little to no impact on anyone, was our life as important? Now, of course, I know you could debate all day long, theologically speaking, that in the eyes of God, every life is important, and you would be absolutely right. Nobody's arguing that point with you. Nobody's going to debate you on that. All lives matter to God, and in the eyes of God, He loves everybody. Nonetheless, in the eyes of humanity, and based on the impact we have on people's lives, some lives are more important than others. That's just, you know, that's true because you believe that, as well as the average human being on earth. Most people believe that those who have the biggest impact, I'm speaking about general human understanding, they believe that the biggest impact is caused by those whose lives were more important, and then those who we forget about because they didn't impact anyone, their lives were not as important to humanity because they didn't have as big of an effect. And I believe that as born again Christians who are called by Jesus to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world, there should be a strong desire in all of us to want to have a big impact in the lives of people. Our existence shouldn't just be mediocre and uninfluential. Rather, our lives should be highly influential due to a highly disciplined lifestyle. We should leave the world a better place than when we were born. People should be led to Jesus Christ and make it to heaven because you lived. People's lives should have dramatically improved because you existed. You should be remembered as someone who made a positive difference in the lives of others. So, for the next question that I'd like to ask you, and please answer this out loud, what is your vision for the impact you want your life to have on others? Think about that. Meditate on that. I'm going to ask that question again, and then I'd like you to answer that question out loud before you move on any further with this lesson. What is your vision for the impact you want your life to have on others? If you don't have a vision for the impact you want your life to have on others, then stop here and don't proceed any further in this lesson until you verbalize the impact you want your life to have on others. Now, if you're wondering what in God's name do I mean with the word verbalize, let me give you a brief definition. According to the dictionary, the verb verbalize is defined as expressing ideas or feelings in words, especially by speaking them out loud. So when I say that I want you to stop here and don't proceed any further in this lesson until you've verbalized the impact you want your life to have on others, that means I want you to express the idea and the vision of how you want your life to impact others by expressing that in words out loud. I want your brain to engage and hear what your mouth is saying so that your heart will believe you in the process. We should all take personal responsibility for our own part of having a positive impact on other people's lives. I like how Brian Clay once worded it when he wrote, and I quote, he said, "I was blessed with certain gifts and talents, and God gave them to me to be the best person I can be and to have a positive impact on other people." Point number 2, increase my influence. Increase my influence. In order to increase our impact, we must increase our influence. And I'm going to give you in just a moment the definition of that word. According to the dictionary, the word influence means the capacity or power of persons or things to be a compelling force on or produce effects on the actions, behavior, opinions, etc. of others. So when I say that in order to increase our impact, we must increase our influence, the increase of your influence is going to increase, by definition, your capacity or power to be a compelling force on the actions, behavior, and opinions of other people. And we have that power if we will ultimately become highly disciplined. Author Dale Carnegie, who wrote a highly successful book, which I've read and I highly recommend it to you if you've not yet read it, called How to Win Friends and Influence People. This book is one of the most prized books among leadership development, and it is still a bestseller long after this author passed away. Again, author Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Some of you watching this video now, you have this book and you've read it, but I'm going to just remind you, if it's been a while since you've read the book, or for those of you who've never read it, I'm going to give you just a brief synopsis of 10 powerful principles that he taught in the book to show people how to acquire influence over others. And they are as follows, because if we're going to increase our influence, it's good to learn some techniques to increase our influence. Number one, he said, do not criticize, condemn, or complain. Number two, be generous with praise. Number three, remember their name. Number four, be genuinely interested in other people. Number five, know the value of charm. Number six, be quick to acknowledge your own mistakes. Number seven, don't attempt to win an argument. Number eight, begin on common ground. Number nine, have others believe your conclusions are their own. And number 10, make people feel important. If I had the time today, I would love to dive into each one of these points. I think they're very important and interesting in our discussion about trying to increase our influence in the lives of others. But because we don't have time, I encourage you, if you're interested and want to have fun with this lesson and go even further than what I'm able to take you today for lack of time, then dig into each one of these 10 points, repeat it if you need to hear it over again, and you could really get some extra meat out of this message by breaking down these 10 powerful principles taught in the book by Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. But I want you to understand today that increasing our circle of influence is crucial to making a bigger impact on people's lives. Because without significant influence, our impact is diminished. Having much influence is so important for any human who wants to make a big impact on others. Someone once interestingly said, better is the death that impacts many than the life that does not influence anyone. I'm going to read that to you one more time because I think that's very interesting in the concept of how important impacting others is. That this person wrote, better is the death that impacts many than the life that does not influence anyone. Meditate on that for a moment and let that get into your mind as something to chew on, as food for thought. How is it that men such as Abraham or Job or David and so many other biblical characters had such a huge influence in the lives of people they interacted with in their own lifetime? The character and discipline of these biblical figures was so great that their lives still influence us today. Think about that. They've been dead for thousands of years, and yet these great figures of the Bible, because of their personal character and discipline, they still impact our lives and influence our lives even today. So I have another question for you in this section that I'd like you to answer out loud. And the question is, what kind of influence is your life currently having on others? Once again, what kind of influence is your life currently having on others? Answer that before going on with this lesson. I know that the answer to this may be a little uncomfortable for some of you, but I hope that in the discomfort of the answer that some of you may give, that it motivates you and inspires you to change so that your influence will grow and increase. Queen Esther's powerful influence over a king and an entire empire largely arose from her following the great example of her cousin Mordecai. Daniel's power and influence over three different kings and empires he served in his lifetime arose largely from the impact that his example had over the political leaders of his day. So we should desire to have a better influence over others than we are currently having, and we should desire to positively influence more people than we currently are. I think we could make a bigger difference if we really did what I'm talking about here today. So the next point number 3 that I'd like to talk to you about is increase my example. Increase my example. We just spoke about influence. And if we want to increase our influence, we must increase our example. Jesus himself taught that people will follow or imitate an example that is demonstrated to them. For example, in John chapter 13, verse 15, in the King James Version, Jesus himself said, "For I have given you an example that ye should do as I have done to you." So do you notice what Jesus taught there? That you should do as I have done. He said, I've given you an example. And the apostles and those who lived saw his example. And he's saying, now follow the example I've given to you. This is how example produces influence over others. If you will lead by example, others will eventually imitate you. And so since Jesus himself taught this principle, we've got to understand that the increasing of our example and the bettering of our example while we're at it will help us to increase our influence in the lives of others. So if you want to lead, you need to lead by example, and eventually others will imitate you. In 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 12, in the King James Version, the Apostle Paul told Pastor Timothy, he said, "Let no man despise thy youth, but be thou an example of the believers in word, in conversation, in charity, in spirit, in faith, in purity." Notice that Paul was telling this young pastor that it had nothing to do with his age and nothing to do with his stage in life and everything to do with his desire or goal to impact lives, particularly in his case as a pastor, but generally even as a Christian. If we're going to impact people, his particular advice to to Timothy, was to be an example of the believers. And he gave him even some criteria. He said, well, if you want to be an example, here's how you do it. Be an example in the way you speak, in your word, your conversation, in your charity. In other words, how you love people, in your spirit, in your faith, in your purity, your morality, your acts of faith and love and generosity. These are things that will be an example to others if you will live them. And by doing these things, you will have a greater influence on others because of your example. So Paul the apostle taught Timothy to be an example to the people by his lifestyle. Why would he teach him this? Because Paul understood the power and influence that our example can have on other people. And that principle or concept and idea is still the same in 2020 as it was 2,000 years ago. This principle is still just as powerful now as it was then. That's why, interestingly, Albert Schweitzer once remarked that a good example has twice the value of good advice. You can give people a lot of good advice. And I've learned over the years that a lot of times, no matter how good the advice and how well intentioned your motives are, it can often go in one ear and go out the other, because just as normal human nature tends to be, for the average human, we don't tend to pay attention to people as much as we should. But we do notice what they do by their lifestyle and their example, which is why I believe Albert Schweitzer remarked that a good example has twice the value of good advice. So just imagine how much more influential our lives would be if we lived as a better example. Timothy had a great mentor in the Apostle Paul, because Paul lived by a tremendous example. His personal example and lifestyle led many people to Jesus Christ. And I think that some of the most inspirational people on earth today are the people whose examples are so awesome that they make us want to be better people and live better lives. Sometimes these people can be great mentors, but regardless of whether you know them or not personally, you may know someone like this, you may not, but you can still find great examples in all kinds of disciplines and fields whose very lifestyle, in other words, their example, greatly inspires you to do better in every area of your life. So when I say that you can still find great examples in all kinds of disciplines, I'm meaning all across the board with all kinds of different careers and subjects. There are people who are great examples all over the world in different areas, and I'll point out just a few in a moment. But these people, because they are great examples in their particular field, they inspire us to want to do better in that particular area. Now, the famous American writer, author, and humorist known as Mark Twain, who was once lauded as the greatest humorist that the United States has produced, once jokingly wrote, "Few things are harder to put up with than the annoyance of a good example." I'm going to read that again and I'm going to elaborate a bit because some of you may not have understood that. But he said, "Few things are harder to put up with than the annoyance of a good example." That made me chuckle when I read that quote because, in my opinion, I think what he's trying to say, and I think we could probably relate to this, one reason why so many people are annoyed, per se, by someone else's good example is because it forces you to be introspective about your own lifestyle and how short of the mark we are from what we could be when we see somebody else living a higher standard because they have greater discipline in their lives. And so whenever you see somebody who is living by a great example, it can make many people uncomfortable because now it takes away your excuse to say it can't be done. It takes away your lies and excuses that you say when you say nobody's doing it. Well, of course, that's not true. Somebody just showed you by their example that it can be done, that someone is doing it, someone is living it, which is why the humorist Mark Twain joked about that few things are harder to put up with than the annoyance of a good example, because now you have to come to terms with your own laziness or lack of discipline or whatever excuse you have for why you think something can be done and why it can't be done and why you don't want to do it. Now you see the example somebody else is doing, and people will compare you perhaps to the example that you're looking at or the person living the good example, and it makes us have to step up our game if we don't want to be considered less than what we potentially could be. So I've got an action point for you that I'd like you to participate out loud with this particular point in this lesson. Name at least a few people whose example you consider inspirational and discuss what it is about their example that you consider influential and inspirational. Once again, name at least a few people whose example you consider inspirational and discuss what it is about their example that you consider influential and inspirational. Once you're finished with that, I do have a question I'd like you to answer out loud as well. And here's the question. What are some things you do daily that you believe are a good example for others? Once again, what are some things that you do daily that you believe are a good example for others? Now, I'm sure some of you here may have more things that you could add. If you are a highly disciplined person and you're doing a lot of good things daily that you think are a good example, it may be easier for you to answer this question. For those of you who Maybe you don't feel like you're doing as much. I'm sure there's still something you can find. Don't beat yourself up and be pessimistic and negative. There's got to be at least one thing that you do daily, at least I hope, that there's at least one thing you do every day that is a good example to others. So go ahead and answer that question. And now we're going on to point number 4. Point number 4 in this lesson, and point number 4 is my final point, is increase my discipline. Increase my discipline. The definition of the word discipline, because it is known as a noun and also as a verb, and I'm going to give you, in the context of today's lesson, both the noun and the verb's definition for discipline, so you understand what I'm speaking about. Because sometimes when we speak about discipline, some folks are thinking about chastisement and castigation. That's not what I'm speaking about. I'm speaking about the contextual form of definition, which is defined as a noun, in this case, the controlled behavior resulting from discipline. The controlled behavior resulting from discipline. And as a verb, it is defined as to train oneself to do something in a controlled and habitual way. Once again, train oneself to do something in a controlled and habitual way. And that's where I really think there's a better definition for this particular context here today, because we can be trained, whether self-trained and self-taught or trained by somebody else who's doing better in a particular area than we are. We can be trained to do things in a controlled and habitual way where it becomes a daily habit. And that's basically what discipline comes down to. It's when you do something out of habit, because you've trained yourself to make this thing happen. And by increasing our discipline, we can increase our example. One of the biggest reasons I think that we fail in so many areas of our lives is because our lack of discipline. I hope that you can be honest at this point in the lesson, because I can admit that for my own life. I know there's areas in my life where, because of a lack of discipline, I have not made the progress I would like to make, and I have to work on my discipline. And I think all of us, we can admit that one of the biggest reasons we fail in so many areas of our lives is because our lack of discipline. Our influence isn't as great as it could be because we're highly undisciplined in so many ways. But I want you to understand, you do have the power to be disciplined. This is not in the realm of science fiction. This is not impossible. All things are possible to him that believes, and I can do all things through Christ who gives me the strength. In order to increase our impact on others, we must increase our example. And one major way that we do that is by increasing our discipline. We can't be a good example to others in areas of our lives where we're undisciplined. But I say that with a caveat, because I want you to understand something. I don't want you to believe that because you're undisciplined in one particular area of your life, that means you can't be a good example to anybody in any way possible. That's a lie. That is not true. You need to discard any thought to the contrary, because just because you're undisciplined in some areas of your life, you may be highly disciplined in other areas of your life. And it is in those areas where you can make your biggest impact. But you can work on the areas where you are undisciplined so that you increase your influence and impact on others. And it's really only in the well-disciplined areas of our lives where we have the biggest influence over others because of our example. If you ever wonder why so many professional personal trainers have so many followers, like if you go to Instagram or even YouTube, there are lots of popular personal trainers on there with lots of followers, and obviously many of them with many clients, because many followers often turn into many clients. And one reason why they have that success and they're so highly influential is because of their tremendous personal discipline in their dietary habits and in their exercise habits, which has produced for them a highly fit and healthy body that everybody else wants to have. So people see them and say, wow, look at that. I want to look like that. I want to be like that. I want to have that. But because we don't have the same discipline and exercise habits as those highly disciplined personal trainers, we don't have the same results that they do. But we could follow their influence, or even better said, we can follow their example because they're great examples in those areas. And by their example, they will influence us to do better so that we can have the same results that they have. So you can have what they have if you will do what they do. Never think that it's beyond your reach or out of your ability and capacity to attain these things. That's not true. We have to stop believing lies. We can do more than we can ever imagine, but we have to be willing to be disciplined to obtain extraordinary results. Another example I'd like to share with you, for example, if you ever wonder why so many highly successful entrepreneurs have so many followers who then become clients, and their clients who are followers as well go on to spread the word by word of mouth for these business owners who are highly successful entrepreneurs, it is often because of their great personal discipline practices applied in their businesses, which causes others to be inspired and want to imitate them. In fact, a lot of businesses that exist today are just spin-offs off of somebody else's idea, and they took that idea under inspiration and said, I could probably do better, and they raised the bar, and they started a highly successful business as a result. But they were influenced by somebody else's business, somebody else's idea. Some of the greatest Olympic athletes in history are the ones who were highly disciplined to consistently train to be the best. And one example that always stands out in my mind is one of the greatest soccer players of our time, Cristiano Ronaldo, has publicly declared and said how he had stayed on the field long after his comrades had gone home for the day and said, I'm going to stay out here and practice more. And of course, he became one of the legends and the greats in the soccer world. And his paycheck obviously followed in that footstep because he also became one of the highest paid soccer players in the history of the world. But what got him to that point, along with any of the other great Olympic athletes in history that you can watch videos about or Google them or hear about them or read about them in books, it is because they were highly disciplined to consistently train to be the best. They didn't just train once a week, once a month, only when it was convenient. No, I'm sure there were very inconvenient times, but because of discipline, they made it happen. It became ritual for them, per se. It was habitualistic. It was something they made happen consistently, and they became the best because of it. Some of the greatest musicians of all time are the ones who were highly disciplined enough to consistently practice music in order to become the best. And you could probably, again, follow the thought pattern, the studying of people who were great musicians, some of the greatest of all human time. And you will probably find a high level of discipline because they were consistent in practicing music. They weren't these ones, again, who just practice for 5 minutes once every now and then. No, these guys and these gals were people who practiced daily, sometimes for hours. They had the discipline to make it happen, and they became some of the best musicians that planet Earth has ever known. People who have a high ethic of personal discipline can usually achieve whatever they want. I think one name that stands out in my mind is David Goggins. Google him, YouTube him, you can read about him. But this man had or developed. He wasn't always that way. If you read his story, that's not how he started, but he developed. One reason I like to share that story is because regardless of what level you feel you're at right now, don't be discouraged and think you can't reach a higher goal, because David Goggins wasn't always what he is today. He developed a high ethic of personal discipline, as can any one of us. And he achieved what he set his mind to do. So if we can learn to have a high ethic of personal discipline, we can become highly influential on others' lives. Now, how how do highly disciplined people become highly disciplined? Now, that might be the question of the day for many of us. And of course, I'm not asking you to answer that out loud. I'm posing that as just something to reflect on. But how do highly disciplined people become highly disciplined? This isn't something you can buy with money. You don't inherit this because your parents leave it in the will for you, or inherit it via DNA and genes. That's not how that comes. It's something that must be practiced daily. Discipline comes from daily practice. I'm going to say that again. Discipline comes from daily practice. And some of you may be familiar with an old quote that says practice makes perfect. And of course, I don't believe any of us are perfect. And I know that the quote perhaps had great intentions, but I think the better way to word that would be practice makes better. And if you can learn to practice daily, to do something daily, or certain habits or rituals or customs that you make happen every day, then you will become highly disciplined in those areas. And if any area that you want to become highly disciplined in, you need to make it a daily practice. People who have a big enough motivation, and that's another key. Your why has to be big enough. People who have a big enough motivation will make themselves do whatever it takes in order to become successful in whatever it is they're seeking success. So these people don't take excuses as the final word. They don't make a lot of excuses. They make things happen because their motivation or their why is big enough. So they do whatever they have to do in order to become successful in whatever it is they're seeking success, and they usually succeed in those areas. As Kim Brenneman once wisely observed, discipline is being able to force yourself to do something in spite of how you feel over and over until it becomes a habit. I think she worded that wonderfully. So I'm going to read that to you again, because that's how I think most of the greats became disciplined. Like I said, you don't buy this with money. You can't go to Walmart and ask them to give you 10 ounces of discipline and a pound of good habits. You don't buy these things in the store. No. She said that discipline is being able to force yourself to do something in spite of how you feel over and over until it becomes a habit. I know there's personal trainers out there who are on top of their game, and you think they always feel like going to the gym or going outside for a run or exercising all the time. No, but they make themselves do it in spite of how they feel, because it is a habit. They've become disciplined enough to make this a daily habit, and the results speak for themselves in their fit, healthy bodies. People who are great cooks, they make themselves cook all the time. It's not that they don't take time off. I'm sure they do, but this is not something they do. They're not proverbial weekend warriors. There are people who do this all the time, not just on the weekends. They do this all throughout the week. They're cooking all the time. They're learning, they're studying, they're reading, they're trying to up their game. And so they make a habit of getting better until they're just excellent at what they do. It is a habit. And that's what discipline is. Musicians those of you who are excellent in music, you understand that if you're not practicing every day, you can make all the excuses in the world you want. But if you're not making it happen daily, then you are not disciplined in that area, and you will not have the wonderful results that go along with a highly disciplined practice in music, for example. So I really hope and pray that God would help us to be more disciplined in our lives. That needs to be something we focus on every single day. God help us to be more disciplined in our lives. Our legacy and our impact on others will be ultimately determined by the level of discipline that we were willing to practice in our own lives. If we're going to change the world, we need to start with our own discipline. If we can increase the level of our self-discipline in our lives, then our example and ultimately our influence over others will be greatly increased. So I've got a question for you, then I'm going to follow with an action point before I conclude with today's lesson. And the question is, do you consider yourself to be a highly disciplined person? Once again, do you consider yourself to be a highly disciplined person? Answer that question. And as a follow-up question, just for fun, because sometimes we say one thing about ourselves, but other people think completely different about us. The follow-up question is, do others consider you to be a highly disciplined person? Once again, do others consider you to be a highly disciplined person? Finally, for the final action point, I'd like you to name at least a few areas specifically of your life in which you seriously want to increase the level of your discipline. Once again, name at least a few areas specifically of your life in which you seriously want to increase the level of your discipline. And then discuss specifically the impact or influence that your life will have on others when you finally increase your discipline in those named areas. Once again, discuss specifically the impact or influence that your life will have on others when you finally increase your discipline in those named areas. In conclusion today, and I hope that this sermon really helped and blessed you and encouraged you and inspired you to do better, but I want you to know that we have the power to change the world. We can start by influencing those we're closest to, such as our family and our friends. We can extend that influence over coworkers and colleagues at work. We can also use that influence to positively affect the people we worship with at church. So your influence extends far beyond just your inner circle at home. It goes to wherever you are if you're willing to live that life. And ultimately, we can use our greater influence to change everyone else that we interact with. People's lives should be positively impacted because we lived. When people meet us, there should be something about our example that inspires them to want to be better people. We can truly make a difference in the lives of others, and we can be the salt and the light and the city on a hill that Christ called us to be. And we can make the difference we were destined to make if we want to increase our impact. We must increase our influence. If we want to increase our influence, we must increase our example. If we want to increase our example, we must increase our discipline. May these principles guide your life as you endeavor to make a greater impact in your world. God bless you, and I'll see you next time.